Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? This week's news item sees a lot of information coming out about vaccines, whether it is an antitrust lawsuit, the interesting relationship between COVID-19 vaccines and reduced risk of diabetes, or the approval of the RSV vaccine. Further to that, genetic therapy has led to a girl with a deadly condition being healed for life. Finland and the UK are both taking a look at youth gender medicine, and possibly that it is a bad decision to make. There's also investigations as to how we could take CO2 and make it part of a circular economy of sorts. The timestamps for these and other news items can be found in the description box below. Starting with vaccine news, and specifically the ridiculous claims made by Robert F. Kennedy Jr. in their lawsuit against the vaccine system as it stands now. The idea is basically that vaccine manufacturers are protected from lawsuits. In lieu of that, there is the Vaccine Adverse Events Compensation Scheme. This means that the government views vaccines as so beneficial that they cannot afford to mire the vaccine manufacturers in so many lawsuits that they would be bankrupted. Therefore, the government has taken on the responsibility of paying out any possible damages. As you can imagine, the government is not someone you want to sue if you can avoid it. They nearly always win, simply because they have more time and money available. This is why Kennedy Jr. has targeted a different group, specifically the Trusted News Initiative, which exists to directly mitigate the misinformation from anti-vaxxers like Kennedy Jr. Their argument is that it is a violation of the Sherman Act or the Antitrust Act. It is worth us pointing out that many of the participants in this program are, let's say, questionable in their actions. For example, BBC, The Washington Post, Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. All of these have had a history of issues to do with moderation of content that has later proven to be true. Concurrently to that, the same argument could be made about anti-vaccine rabble-rousers, who have, for a long time now, made spurious claims that are ill-founded at best and in other cases outright wrong. To try and put this in context might be easier to understand. What's being argued here is that the Trusted News Initiative is very similar to what Google has as far as the internet is concerned. That is, they control search results, so you don't get exposure unless they want you to have that they can control whether or not you can advertise, and importantly, there is no alternative to them, or at least no effective alternative. In doing so, because they have, for all intents and purposes, a monopoly, and in this case, if Google was to work with Facebook, Twitter, and any other online platform, they would be able to prevent the message from being spread. As such, the Sherman Act is being claimed as the legal basis for this. And while it hasn't yet been taken before a judge for the purposes of actually hearing the case initially, the hope is that it will be kicked back and basically told either you need to fix this or it'll be thrown out entirely. The reason this may or may not yet be thrown out is that the case is riddled with flaws, and although there's a lot of legal technicalities to this, one of which is basically the DMCA protection or Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which allows social media companies like YouTube to moderate their content while claiming not to moderate their content. Obviously, this would be a very strong protection against this lawsuit, so they've gone against the group representing them instead. Secondary to that is that there is no economic impact to them in terms of what's actually happening. They're not being told, we won't host your content. What they're being told is that we have our own publications which may or may not directly contradict what you are claiming. Finally, there is a Supreme Court case that they keep citing. The problem is that same case may completely undermine their own arguments, despite being repeatedly cited as the authority on which they should be entertained. And that is that the case in question, called Associated Press v. United States in 1945, basically argued that there had to be a concerted effort for these to work together to stop something from happening, and that is generally directly stopping a product from being sold, in that case news. And the problem with this case is that they're not being limited by access, they're simply having competition generated that counters their argument. And that big difference is very important. While this is just the opening stages of what's happening, the hope would be that the judge hearing the matter would look at what's being presented and either dismiss the case or give them a very limited time frame to try and correct the inadequacies of their pleadings. However, that may or may not happen due to purported biases on the part of the judge. Further vaccine news this week includes the findings from a relatively limited study that COVID vaccines could reduce the risk of developing type 2 diabetes from COVID infection. Now understand that as it stands, this is a long-term effect of COVID infection and it is a relatively rare result. So it's important to keep that in mind to start with. This is already a very small scale effect, admittedly one that will have lifelong effects on the individuals who receive it, but also that the mitigating effect is only found in a small study itself. The original study relies on a little under 24,000 adult patients, and about 54% of them were female. Each had been infected with COVID-19 at least once. Those who had been infected with COVID-19 overall had a 58% higher chance of developing new cases of type 2 diabetes. There was a 78% increased probability of developing diabetes in the non-vaccinated group, and the vaccinated group had a 7% greater probability. This means that there is a roughly 71% gap between vaccinated and non-vaccinated as a relative risk. So remember, this is a relative risk, so this is the normal risk multiplied by 1.78. So we're not talking about a huge increase here. It's not even twice as high, but even not being twice as high is still an increase, and one that could have massive ramifications for the individuals. It is, however, a single study based on a single site, which doesn't have as many individuals involved as we'd like to see for this kind of conclusion to be made. But it is there, and as a result, it's worth keeping in mind. Vaccines provide more protection than just against COVID-19, but this is true of any vaccine. They all provide long-term protection across multiple different parts of health, whether that is reproductive health in the case of measles, physical health and avoiding death for measles, or simply the cosmetic and therefore psychological effects of not having scarring. Further to the vaccine news we've stated, the FDA the Respiratory Syncytial Virus, or RSV virus, vaccine. This is a vaccine that will prevent serious illness, if not death, in infants. Unlike the typical course of infant vaccines though, this is not administered to them when they're born, for example, like the vitamin K shot. Instead, this is administered to the pregnant mother in either the late second or third trimester of pregnancy, and it imparts the necessary protection to the developing fetus, come infant. However, the protection does only last for 6 months, so this is not exactly a perfect mechanism. It is, however, a hell of a lot better than no protection at all, given the consequences yet again. The benefits, as we stated, are nice, but to quantify the results, it had an 82% rate of preventing severe disease in infants in the first 3 months, and it had a 70% rate at preventing hospitalizations in the first 6 months. So this is not a perfect solution, but then again, the vaccine is very new, and likely iterations in the future will build on this and make it much better. Look at it this way, one vaccine given to the mother in the last trimester of pregnancy could lead to a reduction of between 58 and 80,000 hospitalizations in children under 5 if the CDC data for the rate of RSV is entirely accurate, and that the less serious infections, which are mostly mild cold and similar like, are not counted in that. The timing for this is not insignificant either. Over the last couple of years, Most children who would have otherwise been exposed to RSV have not been. The reality is, by the age of 2, most children should have had RSV because they've engaged with other individuals who would have infected them at some point. At the moment, however, basically any child between the ages of 2 and 4 may not have ever seen it, and therefore are at severe risk of getting RSV and possibly being hospitalized. The downside to all this good news is that it seems unlikely that not only will the approval not occur until August in its entirety, but that they won't be able to roll out the vaccine until August at the earliest, and that is a very optimistic timeline. Now that you're suitably disappointed, let's go to news that should at least pick you up a little bit. The NHS, or UK's health system, has given the first ever genetic modification therapy for a condition called metachromatic leukodystrophy. This is a pathology that leads to damage to the nervous system and organs, followed by death at a very young age. The treatment for this was basically nothing until now, or at least nothing until gene therapies became increasingly common. The 19-month-old child from Northumberland in the UK is now considered disease-free. The caveat to all of this good news is that the drug involved is the world's most expensive drug, called Limbaldi. It is listed at a price of $2.8 million. Yes, $1 million. This is ridiculous, but the parents apparently had to pay considerably less than that since they were given a discount. The way it works is just the same as most gene therapies do now, and that is to insert functional versions of the gene needed into the person who's receiving the treatment. This means that they are now able to produce what is required. For example, sickle cell anemia, you now produce properly formed red blood cells, therefore no longer having sickle cells. The process itself is not exactly pleasant though, and it does involve extracting either blood or bone marrow and then modifying this genetically and then putting it back into the person who made the bone marrow in the first place. This is obviously going to be rather painful for a child, but it does provide lifelong benefits and protection from their genetic condition. The downside to all of this is that it's not able to retroactively fix what has already happened, and so it needs to be administered before damage caused by the disease has progressed. If that doesn't happen, it can't help. It can only stop further damage caused by MLD. In fact, that's exactly the situation that happened with the parents of this child. There were 2 young girls, both accepted into the test of this initially. The problem is that the elder daughter was too old, and as such wasn't eligible for the treatment, and therefore would continue to deteriorate in health and condition until eventually dying. The younger daughter received the therapy. Now that you are depressed once more, time to make you happy, or at least happier than you might otherwise be. Research indicates that black tea can help prevent heart disease, but only in the elderly. And yes, this is one of those research scenarios in which a relatively lazy modification to diet and behavior seems like it could be the solution to everything. Like, for example, drinking red wine and claiming it's part of the Mediterranean diet. The reality is that there is limited research indicating black tea does have health benefits, but it's not much different to drinking green tea or other flavonoid-rich products, and that's because of what they do. These are fundamentally products that act exactly the same way as antioxidants. They are products that will go around your body and combine with and neutralize radical oxygen species, thereby preventing vascular damage. So far, everything sounds relatively simple and straightforward. Drink black tea, have a better chance of being healthy in the long term. That is until you look at the details of the study. And this is where things get overblown, let's say. The study had 881 females with an average age of 80, and who were all relatively overweight. This means that we already have a very high-risk group for individuals developing cardiovascular disease. The data shows that those who consume black tea on a regular basis, or somehow or otherwise had a high level of flavonoids in their diet, were less likely to develop the cardiovascular disease that was the focus of this study, specifically the abdominal aortic calcification, or development of hardened aorta, or the primary blood vessel in your body for the movement of blood after the heart. The group who had a higher intake were 40% less likely to develop this condition, and if you drank 2 to 6 cups of tea, it was 42% less chance. So again, it is a fairly substantial change, but it is a tiny study that relied very much on a longitudinal study involving surveys. This is a problem. It doesn't really work very well to see whether or not that is the end result in truth. That's because you're only observing results, therefore getting something of a correlation and not causation. Because there's not a lot of information about what else is going on. For instance, are they on various different drugs, some more suitable than others for individuals? Are they reliably taking their medication? Are they engaging in more physical activity? There are a lot of variables that could come into play, especially in a group that is as high risk as these are. As such, the study needs to be taken with an incredible amount of salt. Honestly, almost more salt than study. The next 2 articles we have for you are both somewhat controversial in their nature. Notably that they're looking at the actions relating to youth gender medicine, or youth that are transitioning. This is a area that at the moment is getting a lot of public attention, let's say, either because individuals are transitioning as a youth without their parents knowing, or similar issues to do with the confluence of personal health and medicine decisions, and the role of both schools and parents in that. The article in question comes from Tablet, and it talks about one of Finland's top medicine practitioners in this area, Dr. Rita Kurtu-Katiala, and how they had an interview in the Helsingin Sanomat. The contents of the interview talk about the Dutch protocol, specifically a protocol used for puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones for adolescence and gender dysphoria. They compare their methods and approach to what's occurring in America, and their findings were uncomfortable. What they noticed is that their patients, and for that matter many of the American patients, did not match the profile of those who would be treated in the Netherlands under the Dutch protocol's relatively strict requirements. This is a concern given that at the moment there has been a huge increase in the number of children transitioning, significantly more so than at any other time when this has been possible, and it has raised concerns in multiple different areas of society. The article refers to the UK's Tavistock Centre, which is a gender transitioning centre in the UK, which saw a 3,360% increase between 2009 and 2018, and there's more details on that in the next article. What is interesting is that among this huge increase, the most significant part was amongst females, who represented a 4,400% increase. Where this becomes a minefield we need to weave through very carefully is the findings from 3 independent systematic reviews conducted in 3 separate countries, specifically Finland, Sweden, and the UK. All of these independent reviews found that the research supporting the use of hormone interventions for adolescents was of very low certainty. This meant that they were fundamentally poor studies indicating that there would be benefits in doing so. Remember, this is 3 separate countries running 3 separate reviews, all reached the same conclusion, and that's not a good sign for what's happening. Further, the research found that the evidence supporting the Dutch protocol was of very low certainty, and so even though it's a more strict criteria, even it is not necessarily well grounded in evidence. During the interview, they stated that when an individual is given the necessary support and help during puberty to accept their body as it is, 80% will do so. 20% will eventually move on to transition of their own accord or otherwise adapt to their life as they see fit. If, however, during puberty they are transitioned, none do so. The article does go into further detail on a lot of the issues around this, and particularly what happens in America. Understand that this is not a simple topic, and so it's worth at least keeping in mind that this is already a minefield that we've had to weave through carefully with YouTube's stupid rules. Going from Finland, we can go to the UK, and specifically a look into the Gender Identity Development Service. This is basically Tavistock, but there was also another location called Portman. The problem is that these two locations and the services itself, often given by the acronym Gids, is under a lot of, let's say, pressure at the moment. Part of this comes from research, like we've mentioned. It also comes from a book that's been published recently by someone named Hannah Barnes. It is based on 100 or more hours of interviews with clinicians, former patients, and experts, and the many pages of notes that are attached to this. It also includes statistics and seems to be, at least according to The Guardian, which is a very liberal source of information, fair-minded and scrupulous, which, from their point of view, is probably high praise. The book itself was initiated because of the sudden increase in 2005, and specifically concerns from staff that there had been a significant increase in the number of referrals for hormone replacement therapy or hormone blockers that would have drastic and lifelong effects on adolescents. The concern here is that this has then blown up after the fact, as we mentioned. A 4,400% increase in females and an average of 3,300% increase overall. Barnes has put forward an argument that they were progressively lowering the age at which they initiated hormones or hormone blockers for children, going from a child of 12 in 2011 to a 10-year-old child in 2016. Most concerningly is that internal research into this by Gids found that they did not appear to lead to any improvement in the children who were taking them's psychological well-being, which was the whole foundation for why they were being prescribed in the first place. This is further compounded by the fact that there were very few staff relative to the huge increase in the number of individuals attending. In 2009, there were 97 referrals. In 2020, there were 2,500, a more than 25-fold increase. The problem is there weren't enough staff, and there weren't enough experienced staff, with most of them being juniors, who could provide the necessary talking or psychological support and counselling that was the primary purpose of Gids. Further to that, there were some charities that were very closely involved with them, and that they were pushing for the prescription of hormones or hormone blockers. As the article explains, this led to very fast turnaround times that were most certainly not in line with the Dutch protocol. The Dutch protocol normally requires at least 6 months of psychotherapy. This was done after only 2 consultations. This means that it could be as little as 1 week, if not 2 weeks, until someone was prescribed hormone blockers or hormones. Further to that, there was not much in the way of follow-up. Therefore, there's no idea as to whether or not the Tavistock Centre and Portman were doing their job. And that's a huge issue. There is rarely a situation in which a doctor would prescribe medication and then not have any follow-up to make sure the medication is doing what it's supposed to do. The reason the Dutch protocol and other similar sort of systems to facilitate transitioning exist, and why they have a very large psychological and psychiatric part to them before transitioning, is that there are many conditions that could incline someone to believe that they are trans or that they are not comfortable in their body. And as such, understanding if it's this, or if it's something underlying that's causing it, therefore they can treat them and make them comfortable as who they are, is better. In terms of Gids, more than a third of the people referred appear to have autism traits, and this is something that's not new. Research has indicated for a while now that autism is overrepresented, at least at present, amongst those who are transitioning, especially amongst females. Note that it's a third of those referred, but less than 2% of children in the UK overall. The Guardian goes into much more detail on issues to do with the internal operations of the clinics and the experiences of staff, along with other issues. If you'd like to read the book itself, it's called Time to Think, The Inside Story of the Collapse of Tavistock's Gender Services for Children by Hannah Barnes, and it's available for about £20, or as The Guardian says, you can order through them. Going from health news that's controversial to health news that's possibly controversial, but certainly much better received. The idea that changing to a 4-day work week would be better for health. Now, a 4-day work week is something many people might consider desirable. It gives you 3 days to enjoy. However, the question then is this going to affect income? Will it affect things like company productivity and more? The recent research from the UK indicates that it may not have any overall negative effects, and, at least in theory, it's going to have much greater health benefits for those involved. It is, however, a very small study again, with 61 companies and around 3,000 workers over 6 months, so there are a lot of concerns to be raised in that alone. The study design itself is rather difficult to accept as it is. Notably, it can't be blinded, which, well, yes, nobody's going to really be taking that as anything but rather obvious indication of what's happening. Further, all the people involved had to self-report, and given that this is to their benefit, they're likely self-reporting in a way that makes the 4-day workweek seem much more beneficial than it might actually be. So we have a small study. It's relatively limited in what it can conclude, and some of the conclusions reached are possibly not as valid as you might hope. The actual results found were that of the 61 companies, 56 are going to continue with the 4-day workweek, which is 92%, and 18 of those confirmed that the policy is permanent, and that means it'll be going forwards exactly the same. The shorter work hours were apparently helpful for employees, with 39% less stressed and 71% had reduced levels of burnout. The key here is that for most companies, their concern was not necessarily staff turnover. Admittedly, losing veteran staff is bad, but they are replaceable. What is beneficial is that the companies saw an increase on average of 1.4% in their income or revenue. That's kind of good news. Not necessarily good news in that you have one fewer day of work, but that you see a reduction in costs of things like utilities, which would be things like power, water, and so on. So you're seeing a reduction in office-based expenses while an increase in income. The article from Science-Based Medicine goes into more details on benefits such as reduced number of sick days taken and the impact on the health of individuals, and you'll find a link to the article below. The idea of a 4-day work week might be very appealing to you. The problem is that, much like a lot of research, it's possibly fraudulent in its nature, and there's not a lot of motivation to do anything about it. The article in The Economist goes into some of the details on just why exactly this is happening. For example, citations are great for the researcher, and if the publisher has it there and somebody continues to have their research cited, they're paying to access that article. This means that if the methodology or the results are either flawed or done using problematic methodologies that later prove to be misconduct, the article should retract it because it's going to waste everybody else's time, effort, money, and reagents. But they don't, or at least not without a lot of time and effort, as we've shown last week, where it took a very long time to get 24 papers retracted because of issues that were very easily identified. We already have several videos on things like how an article is retracted, how peer review works, and dodgy predator publishers, this doesn't really provide anything new, just more current examples and someone's personal experience in doing so. We'll refer you to our videos on this topic for more information, or you can read the article for yourself in the description box below. The final article we have for you this week is all about how we can use CO2 and put it into a circular system and therefore create a CO2 economy that doesn't produce any more CO2. The idea is not that crazy. We have 8 billion people on the planet now, and in the near future likely to go over 10 billion. All of those people are going to be making their own things, using energy. They're going to be contributing to the generation of CO2 in one form or another, whether that is cooking, driving, things they purchase. Anything will contribute to that, unless we start relying more heavily on things like renewables. However, even that doesn't really solve the problem. Industry is still going to be producing it, to a certain extent agriculture will, and so we need to find ways to capture CO2 and isolate it and then use it. This is where the article from the Neurologica Blog is helpful as a nice summary on what could possibly be done. For example, there are proposals and in fact even prototype systems for taking CO2 and using it as a way of powering turbines by storing it in large containers, what is basically a massive concrete bunker that acts as a tank. This tank gets pressurized during the day, and overnight, the CO2 is released to power turbines, thereby generating electricity, but it doesn't get released to the environment. Rather, it's released, goes through the turbine, and gets pumped into other storage tanks, where it can then be moved back into the primary tank and pressurized once more the next day. That's one way of continuously using CO2 without adding it back into the atmosphere. The proposal in this article is to make it entirely circular. That is, CO2 could be generated, taken into a system, used in that system, and then put into a second system, and then taken back to the first place and used again there. An example of the phrase they use here, which is often economies favour a circular economy, but because waste is wasteful, but not always, a cheap abundant resource may simply be cheaper than any attempt at recycling, is best exemplified by polystyrene, the white, small, bead-like substance used as packing in many different things. It is a relatively simple thing to recycle for any number of new purposes. You melt it down in sulfuric acid, you then distill off the sulfuric acid, and now you have the polystyrene ready to be used again, but that costs more than making new polystyrene. The simple cost in that is just the energy to distill it, as both the polystyrene can be reused, and the sulfuric acid, because it has been distilled off, can both be reused. That means it's literally cheaper to make something from scratch than it is to have one expense in that scenario of electricity and initial equipment investment. An example given in the article that would perhaps be more useful is that we could use CO2 to generate biofuels. Those biofuels, when burnt, would only release the CO2 that was used in making them, therefore not adding any more CO2 to the environment and atmosphere. Further, if renewable energy in the form of solar and wind, and theoretically nuclear energy, could make it possible for CO2 to be used in a way that is even more efficient than it is now, where it relies on a catalyst of some kind. While light on a lot of the details on how this could be done, the article does put forward an interesting scenario where we could use CO2 to great benefit. It's just a matter of how we go about it. That's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching. If you have found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.